Hello guys, and today's video we will be focusing on defining peace and conflict as well as positive and negative peace alongside measuring conflict. This goes with the IB Global Politics HLSL New Spec course. Firstly, the plan for this video is to cover peace, including positive and negative, as well as conflict, which you can see highlighted. Basic IB definitions. Peace is often defined as both the absence of conflict and violence, as well as a state of harmonious relations. Many also refer to peace as a personal state of non-conflict, particularly within oneself and with one's relationship to others. Peace is the ultimate goal of many organizations that monitor and regulate social relationships. Conflict is the process of actual or perceived opposition between individuals or groups. This could be opposition over positions, interests, or values. Most theorists would distinguish between nonviolent and violent conflict in this distinction. Nonviolent conflict can be a useful mechanism for social change and transformation, whilst violent conflict is harmful and requires conflict resolution. Violence is often defined as physical or psychological force inflicted upon another. In the context of global politics, it could be seen as anything someone does that prevents others from reaching their full potential. This broader definition would encompass unequal distribution of power that excludes entire groups from accessing resources essential for improved living standards or well-being, and discriminatory practices that exclude entire groups of people from accessing certain resources. Non-violence is the practice of advocating for one's own or others' rights without physically or psychologically harming anyone. It often involves actively opposing the system that is deemed to be unjust through, for example, boycotts, demonstrations, and civil disobedience. Theorists argue that non-violence can often draw attention to a conflict situation and that could provide a fertile basis for post-conflict transformation. Application. Drug cartels in Mexico. Look at the image and decide, in this case, is this peace, conflict, or violence? And why did you choose that option or options? I'll give you 30 seconds to think about it. In this instance, this would be considered both a conflict and violent. This is because the cartels control various areas which show territorial conflict within the state of Mexico, and also engage in armed conflict with both the state and rival gangs inflicting physical harm. Now, application. Black Lives Matter protests. In this case, is this peace, conflict, or violence? And why do you choose that option or options? I'll give you 30 seconds once again. In this case, this would be considered a conflict because there is not exactly peace, as the protests are undergoing non-violent protest against the government, showing a lack of harmonious relations. It would not be considered violent as well, as the protesters are not aiming to propagate their cause through armed resistance. This can be defined as a non-violent conflict. What perspectives can influence our understanding of peace, conflict, and violence? Firstly, feminist, religious, environmentalist, realist, capitalist, and levels of analysis/scope. Scope meaning community, regional, global, international. The understanding of peace from a multitude of perspectives can improve your breadth and depth of analysis within your essays, as you can view and critique arguments from alternative perspectives. Johan Vincent Galtung was a Norwegian sociologist and considered the principal founder of the discipline of peace and conflict studies. He was a founder of the Peace Research Institute in Oslo in 1959, serving as its director until 1970. Galtung can help us with our definition of peace, with an explanation of negative peace and positive peace. He is a key figure within the topic of peace and conflict, and we will keep on going back to him. Negative peace is simply the absence of war and/or violent conflict. If there is no state of war or violence between the state and non-state actors, then you could say that there is a state of peace. However, there is still underlying tension within the state of peace. This definition does not consider other forms of conflict or violence. Just because there's an absence of violence and conflict doesn't mean that there is harmonious relations between this state and others. Positive peace is a state of peace where the tension or contradiction leading to a conflict has been resolved and no longer exists. This view of peace looks at the causes of conflict and violence. If the parties involved in a conflict are equal and justice is provided fairly for everyone. Essentially, in a state of positive peace, the factors and underlying issues that created a conflict have been resolved and there is no longer any reason for violence. To what extent do we consider the balance of power between parties in a conflict? People protesting against police brutality is a good example of a conflict between parties with vastly different capabilities. Although conflict between equals in power are common, for example, the Soviet Union versus the US during the Cold War, it is very important to recognize when there is an imbalance of power in a conflict, i.e. state versus the civil society. The relative power of conflict parties has important implications for conflict dynamics, or in other words, how conflicts develop over time. Furthermore, it is less clear which conflict should demand our attention. For example, what is the most pressing conflict in the world today? Is it between the rich and the poor, a conflict of capability and access to resources? Is it between US hegemony and a rising China? Is it the conflict between environmentalism and economic neoliberalism? Is it between a teenage girl who desires to go to school in a religious community but that believes it is not her place to be there? In all of these conflicts, there is a question of power, capability, where power is distributed more or less equally. This power dynamic will shape ways in which the conflict is manifested in real life. We could consider conflict to be an inevitable outcome of human social interaction, as we cannot always agree or hold the same beliefs and values as others. Conflict is an integral component of a functioning democracy, where political parties disagree about how best to govern the state. Therefore, conflict may be seen as a natural or even constructive aspect of human interaction. However, where conflict becomes problematic is when it results in violence and destruction. How can we define the concept of conflict? Johan Galtung defines conflict as incompatible goals. Violence, on the other hand, can be seen as a manifestation of conflict where the pursuit of incompatible goals results in harm to one or both parties involved. How can we measure conflict? HIIK, Conflict Barometer. The HIIK uses a multitude of different metrics when conducting their annual conflict barometer. Some of these metrics include weapons and personnel, what weapons they are using and how detrimental they are and how many they have and how modern, how many people and their skill, casualties, refugees and level of destruction, death toll, hospitals destroyed, infrastructure, roads, amount of IDPs and refugees. What do you think could be a critique of the conflict barometer? I'll give you 30 seconds. From my perspective, it's very rudimentary, meaning things sort of fit in these boxes to be conflicts. Yet there are other issues that can be perceived as conflicts that this criteria will not tolerate. Galton's conflict triangle explained. A. Attitudes. How people feel about the conflict. This includes emotions, prejudices, and perceptions. B. Behavior. What people do in the conflict. This includes actions like protests, violence, or negotiations. C. Contradictions. The root cause of the conflict. This is the underlying issue like inequality or opposing interests. A unique way to remember and to think about this is that behavior is the visible part above the water, but attitudes and contradictions are hidden below. To resolve a conflict, you need to address all three, not just the obvious actions. Take a little minute to look over the conflict triangle model. This will be very important in your analysis of conflicts for your case studies and your essays. What makes a conflict latent or overt? Latent exists underneath the surface but hasn't erupted into direct confrontation. There may be tensions, grievances, or structural inequalities, but they haven't led to open violence or active disputes. For example, economic disparities between social groups that create resentment, but don't lead to protests or violence. Overt is visible and actively expressed through protest, violence, or diplomatic disputes. It's when tensions escalate into direct action, for example, armed clashes between rival factions or public demonstrations against government policies. In the next video, we will focus more on the ideas of violence, including direct, structural, and cultural, as well as the notions of non-violence and non-violent conflict. Thank you.